Well, I wonder what sort of world it is that you want to live in. I don't know if you're the reflective sort of person who found themselves asking that question at the beginning of the new year. What was great about 2021? Probably a shortish list. What would I like to be different in 2022? Or maybe you've turned on the news recently and you've been driven to despair, longing for change, wanting difference. Maybe something happened over Christmas that blew your socks off, that it was so good that you're desperately trying to hold on to it. Maybe you made New Year's resolutions and they're already lying in the dust and you're frustrated about that lack of change. Or perhaps a friend has told you something this week which has been really uplifting, which has changed your outlook, and you're really enjoying that and you're thinking, yes, that's the sort of world I want to live in. I wonder, what is it that you long for in life? And if those questions aren't ones that you naturally find yourself asking, well, we're going to find ourselves asking them as we look at Esther 1 and 2, at the beginning of this incredible story. Because as this book starts, it introduces us to Xerxes' Persian Empire. And Xerxes' Persian Empire, it sort of pulls back the curtain on what our world is like. I've been slightly spooked by how familiar Xerxes' world is to our world, particularly at the moment, as we'll see. Because on the surface, Xerxes' empire, it was an entrancing place, a desirable place, a place where you thought, oh, I want a part of that. It drew you in. And I guess our world does that too, doesn't we? We look at the picture our world presents of itself as we flick through the glossy magazines or scroll through the social media posts, and we think, yes, I like that, I want that. But as you pull back the curtain, as you look behind the scenes, you quickly realize that all that glitters isn't gold. And as we scratch beneath the surface of Xerxes' Persia, we'll see things that are deeply off-putting, shameful, despicable, things we'd want nothing to do with, things that don't lie too far behind the shiny veneer of our society, things that leave us longing for change, that lead us longing for a better kingdom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the start of our reading as we're introduced to Esther's world. Esther 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Now, if you were with us last year when we were looking at the book of Nehemiah, we've sort of wound the clock back another 40 years from Nehemiah's day, if that helps you work out where we are in Bible history. But if your Bible history, if your Persian history is a bit rusty, verse 1 goes on to help us, and it says that this Xerxes is the one who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. Now, that may not help you, so let me show you a map. Xerxes, he pretty much ruled over the whole known world. That big green splodge on the map from India to Egypt and beyond was all part of his empire. And the only bit of the known world that wasn't under his control was that little bit of southern Greece. Everything else was his. And so as we're told that he ruled over these 127 provinces, we're meant to be impressed. We're meant to be even intimidated by his power. Have a look again at verse 2 and just listen to how the language is piled up. At the time that King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, the nobles of his province were present. He invited them and they came. That's the sort of power that this man had, a powerful man throwing a really big party. You may have heard about this. Earlier in the week, plans for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee weekend were announced to celebrate her 70 years on the throne. There's all sorts of things going on, but I guess the focal point is a 4-day weekend at the beginning of June, and there are parties and picnics and pageants planned, all sorts of good things. I'm sure it'll be a grand occasion. But the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, celebrating 70 years on the throne, is nothing compared to this banquet that Xerxes threw in year 3 of his reign. At first, there was the appetizer, verse 4. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. 6 months of wowing his subjects with his splendor, the glory of his majesty. And then after that appetizer, there's the main course, an amazing banquet for his civil servants. And I don't know, as Kirsty read verses 6 and 7 and 8, you sort of got a picture of how grand this occasion was. Let me just pick up on one detail to get us into that world. In verse 7, have a look there with me. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. Now, if you've come to dinner at my house, at the Lee household, you may have noticed that most of our wine glasses are different. They're not gold, but they also but they are different. There's a similarity. Now, that's not because we're Xerxes. It's because over the years, all the sets of wine glasses that we've had, much to Catherine's frustration, I've broken a couple of. And so we've had to get more, and nothing quite matches. Everything is different. But Xerxes, he wasn't clumsy like I am. No, these gold goblets, each different from another, are a sign of decadence. Each one unique, each one exquisitely crafted. And that's not all. Verse 7 goes on. The royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink without restriction. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. It's the sort of open bar that would put the most generous wedding you've ever been to shame. 7 days where the wine flowed, after 6 months where his wealth was displayed to all people. This kingdom was an incredible kingdom, a place of immense power, lavish wealth. And if we're honest, I think it's the sort of kingdom that there's a bit of our hearts that gets attracted by. It's the sort of world that draws us like a moth to a flame, and we hope that if we get close enough, some of its glory might just rub off on us. And like Xerxes did with all his nobles, the sort of the kingdom of our world, it invites us to throw our lot in with it, with the promise, the hope that we may perhaps get a chance to share in its splendor, that the glossy life in some way may be ours. It looks so good, it seems so appealing, it promises so much. And as we said earlier, all that glitters isn't gold. And so let's go back to the party and find out what happens next. Verse 10. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Bethesda, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zephthah, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. What's going on? The party is in full swing. And so the king decides now is the moment to bring out his party piece, which tragically is his queen. There's that horrible phrase we have in the English language, a demeaning phrase, a trophy wife. It's not pretty, is it? And yet that's exactly what Vashti is for Xerxes. Something that's lovely to look at. She wears a crown, but make no mistake, it's only decorative. She has no power. It's a dark scene, an ugly scene. It's a place where, I don't know, the Jeffrey Epsteins of our world would feel right at home. And so here we are, Xerxes' guests, they're there waiting to ogle at his playgirl. And something unexpected happens. Verse 12. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. A shocked hush descends over the banquet as the whispers spread out from the royal throne. The phones come out. Vashti said no, starts trending on Twitter. And then the king, end of verse 12, became furious and burned with anger. And of course, he was angry at Vashti. She had understandably, bravely refused to respond to his beck and call. But the reason his rage runs so deep is because her actions undermine all that the past 6 months have been about. This great display of his power, like a house of cards, comes tumbling down. Because the man who rules over 127 provinces, who rules over most of the known world, can't even control a single person. As we see Xerxes, we're meant to be horrified by him, shocked by him, appalled by him. But we're also meant to laugh at him. He's a joke. It's like the emperor has no clothes, no power. When that curtain is pulled back on the kingdom of the world, we see what it's actually like. It's a place that's dark and ugly. It looks impressive, but it's not. It's a place that looks powerful, but actually it's weak and pathetic. And as the curtain's pulled back, it sort of brings us to our senses, and it shows us what our world is really like, and it should make us long for a better kingdom than this world has to offer. And it's going to do that more because things are about to get an awful lot darker. Don't know what you do when you have a problem in a relationship. Maybe you offer an olive branch to the other person. Perhaps you talk it through with them. Maybe you examine your own motives in all that's just happened. If things are getting really bad, you might ask for outside help. You might ask a counsellor to come alongside you. Well, Xerxes doesn't do any of those things. Have a look at verse 15. in the bit that Kirsty didn't read. What does he do? He calls in the lawyers. And he says to his experts, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. The king asks his lawyers, and as one of his advisors responds, we get a sense, and it's not just the king who's a problem in this kingdom. We get the sense that that ugliness has spread throughout the whole world. Let's have a look at that reply. Down in verse 19. Mehucan says, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter into the presence of King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. Do you see what his concern is? Memucan fears that all the other women in the kingdom might follow Vashti's lead and might start disrespecting their husbands. And make no mistake, he's not talking about withholding the sort of respect that a husband might earn from his wife. No, this is the cowering obedience at the hands of an exploitative oppressor. That ugliness, it's pervasive. It's everywhere. And of course, the irony is not lost, or it's completely missed, rather, by the king's advisors. What does he say? Vashti must not do the thing that she refused to do. They just don't get it. They're a joke. And yet, what do? They rubber stamp this dreadful plan. The kingdom of the world is a horrible, a laughable mess. And it's also a dangerous place to be. Flick over the page to the beginning of chapter 2 with me. Vashti is sent away, and then the king calms down. Later, chapter 2, verse 1, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. And as this search gets underway, we need to be clear, it's not the nice beauty contest that you might read about in the storybook Bibles or on VeggieTales, if you're of that generation. That is not what this is, because, well, it's not a search that you choose to join in. If you were a beautiful young woman in Xerxes' kingdom, no matter where you were in that vast empire, you were brought to Susa. And then when you were in the citadel, it's not like you were free to come and go as you pleased. No, it was like a prison. And verse 4, when it speaks of the young woman who pleases the king, being queen instead of Vashti, we need to be clear that it's speaking about pleasing him in one place and one place only. And that's in the bedroom. Let's call a spade a spade. It's no beauty contest we have here. It's state-sponsored sex trafficking. It's horrific. And it's not just women who are mistreated in this kingdom. I wonder if you noticed, as Kirsty read it for us, that most of the men who serve the king are actually eunuchs. A historian of this time, a guy called Herodotus, a Greek historian, told us that there were over 500 boys a year brought into Susa, trafficked themselves to be castrated, to enter the court as eunuchs. You see, in the kingdom of the world, it seems that everyone's sexuality, male or female, is at the disposal of the king. No one is safe in the kingdom of the world. Exploitation, undignified, horrific, a dark, dangerous, distressing place. What happens next? Verse 5, one of God's people steps on to the stage. In verse 5, we're introduced to Mordecai, the Jew. And what we're told about Mordecai is he's an exile here in Susa. Like God's people in our world today, this place isn't his home. It's not a place that he belongs. He belongs to another kingdom. And verse 7 tells us that Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Mordecai has adopted this cousin. And as she's introduced to us, we see something of the tension that God's people living in exile feel, that we might feel living in the kingdom of our world. Because what do we have? We have this girl introduced both by her Jewish name, Hadassah, and her Persian name, Esther. And as she's introduced with these two names, we're left wondering, well, is she going to be loyal to her people? Or might she be assimilated into the kingdom of the world? Will she stay faithful to God's people, or will she get drawn in to the Persian Empire? Well, maybe that's a tension you feel, a pressure you feel too. Which way am I going to go in the kingdom of the world? We're told that Mordecai adopted her. We're told that maybe she was feeling this tension. And what's the other thing we're told about her? She had a lovely figure and that she was beautiful. We're told about her appearance. And of course, we're not told that because someone's appearance is the most important thing about them. We're told it because it's all that Xerxes is interested in. And so it's no surprise what happens to Esther, is it? She catches someone's eye, she's taken in to the king's palace, and she sits there awaiting her date with the king. Impressed in the bedroom, and the crown may be placed upon her head. Disappointed, she'll be disregarded to join the rest of the king's concubines. It's horrific. And yet for Esther, there are more reasons to be afraid. Jump down to verse 10 with me. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked to and fro near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. You see, Esther, as one of God's people, was in a particularly dangerous place in the kingdom of the world. As Mordecai nervously paces back and forwards outside, it's not just because of the situation that she's in that he's so worried. It's because of her Jewishness as well. The kingdom of the world, it can be a particularly dangerous, particularly harmful place for the people of God. And so Esther, she keeps quiet about her heritage. She does her prescribed beauty treatments and waits for her name to be called. Then, about 4 years after the start of our story, comes her moment. Verse 16, she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 17th year of his reign. This is the night. And there's so much hanging on it. But before we read on, we need to note, it's important for us to note that we're not meant to commend or condone Esther's actions. She's powerless. She has no choice about sleeping with the king. And the narrator, he doesn't make any moral comment about what Esther does. And so neither should we. Well, what does happen? Verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther impresses. She wins the king's favor more than any of the other women. She's crowned queen. But make no mistake, Esther's position is no more secure than Vashti's was. And we get a sense of this in the very next verse, in verse 18, where we read that the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet. For who? For all his nobles and officials. And he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. It's Esther's banquet, but it's not for her. It's for the nobles and officials. It's Esther that prompts his giving of gifts, but they're not for her. They're scattered across the provinces. They're the ones who get to enjoy the celebration. Yes, one of God's people is now centre stage, but her position is a perilous one. Seems nothing has changed in the kingdom of the world. And our time is going, and so it's here we must leave Esther for now, sitting alone as one of God's people in the Persian court. Except there's a sense in which she's not alone, because our world is much like hers, isn't it? As you look around, there might be much that looks impressive, that looks powerful, that looks desirable even. And yet, if you scratch beneath the surface, it's an ugly place. There's abuse of power. There's abuse of people. It's so close to home, painfully close to home. It's a world in which it's a dangerous place, a vulnerable place, particularly perhaps for the people of God. It's a place where we're called to live, but only as exiles, as those who don't belong. And perhaps there's a particular vulnerability in struggling with those questions of our identity. And as we look on, we think, I don't want that world. I think Esther 1 and 2, they leave us longing for a better kingdom. There must be more than this, mustn't there? And yet, as we leave Esther behind in the royal palace, perhaps there's just the faintest glimmer of hope. Because an invisible hand has placed her at the heart of the Persian Empire. And sure, she's weak, she's powerless as queen. But maybe if we can just set our skepticism aside for a moment, there's just enough space to wonder whether she might have the last laugh. Whether the invisible hand that placed her there might use the weak to shame the strong. Because that wouldn't be the first time it had happened in the grand sweep of Bible history. And well, it certainly wouldn't be the last. So as we pause just in that place of wonder and hope, let me lead us in a prayer. Father, thank you for this sobering start to the book of Esther that shows us what our world is like, that pulls back the curtains on the horrors, that leaves us wanting something better, something more. Father, please would you help us to use this passage to show us that all that glitters isn't gold. Use it to change our heart's desire to not be for the things of this world, but for the things of your kingdom. And Father, where our desires are weak, perhaps, would you strengthen us? Would you give us resolve to long for something better, to long for your Son's kingdom, to long for a better King? And would you help us find those things in him? And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.